head to Glasgow now and speak to the Scottish First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. First Minister, very good morning to you.
Good morning.
You will have had time now to review the strikes themselves, the way in which they were conducted, and indeed some further rationale being provided by the Americans and the French. In the light of all of that, do you believe that we were wrong to strike Bashar al-Assad's chemical weapons?
Yes, I do. And for me, the big question is, do isolated airstrikes do anything at all to alleviate the acute humanitarian suffering in Syria, which predates the chemical attack last week? And do isolated airstrikes do anything to take Syria a single step forward towards long-term peace? This is a complex, multi-layered conflict that's now in its 8th year, as well as the civil war in Syria. We see proxy conflicts involving not just America and Russia, but countries like Iran and Turkey and Israel, Saudi Arabia. This is a complicated situation, and I don't believe isolated airstrikes will help resolve that. It hasn't done so in the past. The airstrike on the airbase carried out by the United States round about a year ago, within hours, Syrian warplanes were taking off from that airbase again. What we need is a long-term international approach, not just action that perhaps makes Western leaders feel as if they're doing something. But I have to say, and I don't doubt that these are difficult decisions for the Prime Minister, but what happened on Friday night into Saturday morning felt as if it was more to do with some kind of macho strongman standoff between Trump and Putin, and that should not be the role of UK foreign policy.
As you say, First Minister, the situation in Syria is complicated, ridiculously complicated, and it is certainly perfectly arguable that those airstrikes don't take us a step closer to peace, but they surely do take us a step back from the prospect of Assad using chemical weapons against his people again.
Well, I don't know that that's the case, and certainly, I hope that the Prime Minister sets out much more detail of what her strategy is and what she considers to have been achieved by the airstrikes. But as well as not necessarily taking Syria a single step closer to peace, there is a real danger, and this is an extremely serious point, that airstrikes such as those we saw over the weekend risk, I think, further escalating an already dangerous situation. And we've heard similar concerns expressed by the United Nations Secretary General. And that, I think it's important to stress that the conflict in Syria, it's a complicated civil war, but we see standoffs between a range of other countries, proxy conflicts being waged in Syria as well. So there is a danger that action that is taken hastily, action that doesn't necessarily contribute to peace, actually risks not just escalating the civil war, but escalating the tensions internationally as well. So this, I think, makes it all the more important that leaders take the time to set out their objectives and strategies carefully. I think in a UK context, it is absolutely essential that Parliament is involved. We shouldn't forget that the UK's active engagement in Syria right now was authorised by Parliament in terms of the authority for targeted attacks against Daesh. Now, for the role of UK armed forces to be changed without the approval of Parliament, I think is a serious mistake. And I hope that we see over the next 24, 48 hours a full debate in the House of Commons, not just a statement by the Prime Minister, and a commitment that if there was to be any further action, that has to be authorised and sanctioned by a vote in the House of Commons.
Can I just be absolutely clear as to your position about the involvement in the Commons and all of this? Are you arguing that the Prime Minister has a responsibility, a legal responsibility, to come to the Commons before declaring military action? It seems to me that there are clearly going to be cases where all of the intelligence cannot be shared with members of the House of Commons, and indeed there will be situations in which military action needs to be taken quickly without prevarication and debate.
I accept all of that, and I accept there will be situations, for example, where there is a clear self-defence element where that is the case. I also accept that not all of the intelligence can be shared with the House of Commons. That was the case in previous votes of the House of Commons, and I think there would be a widespread acceptance of that. But, if we cast our minds back to the debacle over the Iraq war, one of the few positives to come out of that was the establishment of the practice that military action should ordinarily be approved and sanctioned by the House of Commons. And I think what we've seen over the weekend is a step back from that, and I think that is deeply regrettable. Now, we can't undo what has been done, but I think it is important that if there is to be any further change to the engagement of UK forces in Syria, that the House of Commons should be asked to sanction that. There's a wider point here as well. Clearly, if the Prime Minister is confident in the approach she wants to take, confidence in the intelligence that underpins that and the evidence that underpins that, and we should remember that the chemical weapons inspectors are only now starting their work in Syria, but if there is a confidence in the position that the Prime Minister is taking, then setting out that clearly in the House of Commons, getting the House of Commons behind her, would actually strengthen her position, not weaken it.
Well, it would strengthen her position politically. It would weaken her position in terms of military strategy, wouldn't it? I mean, if we're talking about taking out chemical weapon sites in Syria, there is a finite amount of them, probably a handful only. Any advanced knowledge given to the Syrians that we are debating a military strike, I mean, surely that just gives them the opportunity to exit stage left.
I think the logical conclusion of the argument you're putting to me there would, have raised deep concerns about the nature of our democracy. I don't think we should see the involvement of the democratically elected parliament of the country in decisions like this as a sign of weakness. Indeed, I think it would be the sign of a strength of democracy. I think everybody, and certainly I, accept that not all detail either of intelligence or of the military strategy should be shared. But asking Parliament for the sanction, for the broad objectives and the engagement of UK forces, I think is something that should be done. I think it should have been done. We can't turn the clock back, but I certainly think that should be done in future. And in terms of the Prime Minister making a statement to the House of Commons tomorrow, I would hope that becomes a full parliamentary debate. These are really serious issues. Nobody, not least me, is doubting the fact that Assad is a brutal dictator with no regard for his own population. We don't yet have the evidence from the chemical weapons inspectors, but I have no difficulty whatsoever in believing that Assad is capable of launching a chemical attack on his own population. The question here is what course of action is best placed to alleviate humanitarian suffering that has been deepening in recent times, not least in eastern Ghouta in Syria, and what takes Syria closer to peace. We have a Security Council resolution passed earlier this year, Resolution 2401, calling for ceasefires to allow the alleviation of humanitarian suffering. We need to see a coordinated international effort towards getting peace in Syria. It's only a few weeks since President Trump was saying that it wouldn't be long before US forces were leaving Syria, and now, of course, we see airstrikes. We need to see commitment from the international community towards peace. Isolated airstrikes may have the semblance of action. It may make Western leaders feel as if they're doing something, but I don't believe, just as they haven't in the past, I don't believe they contribute towards a long-standing and lasting peace in Syria, which is what that country and its population so badly needs.
Ms. Sturgeon, I mean, are you suggesting that you doubt the assessment of the British government, the American government, the French government, that those airstrikes were surgical in their precision, that they have had a seismic effect on Assad's ability to deploy chemical weapons against his own people, and on that basis are justified?
Well, I'm not privy to all of the information. I will listen carefully to all of the information.
How much information would you need? I mean, honestly, we had heard of this event. The intelligence communities of those three nations, again saying chemical weapons were used. All of the available evidence suggests that Assad was responsible. And after the fact, we have the intelligence communities of those three nations suggesting that those military strikes were effective in limiting his ability to use chemical weapons. Where is your problem with the way in which USA, France, and the United Kingdom have operated?
The point I'm making is we've seen airstrikes in the past that supposedly have depleted Assad's ability to launch chemical strikes. That hasn't turned out to be the case. A year ago, the United States launched an attack on Syria air base in Syria, supposedly to deplete the Syrian Air Force's ability. Within hours, there were Syrian warplanes flying from that air base. My point is there is a bigger question here, not just about the depletion of the Syrian capability, but how we take Syria overall towards a sustainable peace. And the question about whether airstrikes in an isolated basis can do that, I think, is a very serious question. Now, let the Prime Minister come to the House of Commons, lay out her strategy in full, and then allow a full debate with a vote as appropriate on the back of that. We all, I think the point of unity here has to be that we want to see Assad stopped from carrying out the kinds of attacks on his own population that we know he is capable of doing, but we also want to see the situation in Syria being resolved. This is a situation
no one doubts that. No one wants to situation to not be resolved. The problem is this. Surely there are all the other options. Indeed, but all of the other options on the table, bringing in the inspectors again, they've said there were chemical weapons used 4 times before, nothing has changed. Go to the United Nations, every time we do that, the Russians use their veto. Bring all the parties together around the table for talks, that failed in Geneva. I mean, what is the plan? You're talking about a plan, but I'm not hearing the detail of it.
Well, let me answer that in several parts. Firstly, you say the Security Council action always fails. There was a Security Council resolution passed a matter of weeks ago, Resolution 2401, that calls for a ceasefire, particularly in areas in eastern Ghouta, to allow humanitarian suffering to be alleviated, to allow civilians to come out. But that's my point. I don't think there has been the concerted patient effort by the international community, and we've heard the UN envoy to Syria, Staffan de Mistura, talk about this in recent weeks. There needs to be a real commitment behind those efforts. There's also further action that can be taken in terms of the chemical weapons programme in Syria, the research centre in Syria that develops the chemical weapons programme. I think there is more action that could be taken to disrupt its supply chains, to disrupt the transport to and from it, to apply sanctions against some of the key personnel in that research centre. There are very few of these individuals subject to UK sanctions. There are actually more subject to US sanctions. So when I hear the Prime Minister saying there's no practical alternative, I would question whether that is really the case, and also question the efficacy of isolated airstrikes when it comes to a long-term sustainable peace. And these are serious matters that I don't think are helped by action being taken with the UK Parliament being sidelined. Let's have full, proper debate about how UK foreign policy and UK action, if that is to be used, if the terms of engagement of UK forces is to be changed, then let us have confidence and a consensus behind that being in the interests of the overall long-term move to peace in Syria.
I mean, do you, First Minister, do you believe wholeheartedly in the kind of the doctrine of humanitarian intervention? I mean, it does strike me that there is perhaps a fundamental hypocrisy on the part of the West, and I include politicians, opposed to airstrikes and those in favour of airstrikes, which is there's an awful lot of hand-wringing in London and Washington and Paris every time that we see chemical weapons being used. But at the same time, hundreds of thousands of people have died, civilians have died through the use of conventional weapons. We seem to hate seeing, pictures of children dead foaming at the mouth, but we don't seem to be that concerned about the fact that, many of them have been killed using flechette rounds, for example.
Absolutely. Well, firstly, if we take the humanitarian alleviation as the legal ground for action that was set out in the UK summary of the legal advice yesterday, I mean, I think just as a matter of fact, there is not international consensus behind that as a legal basis for the kind of action we've seen. The only
Security Council seemed okay with
grounds. Well, let me just say the 2 clear-cut legal grounds, of course, are UN resolutions or self-defence. But there is hypocrisy on the part of the West. If there is going to be a humanitarian intervention ground for action like this, then there is a need for some consistency to be developed in terms of how that kind of principle is applied. We've seen humanitarian suffering in Gaza, in Yemen, the plight of the Rohingya Muslims more recently. There needs to be consistency, because if that consistency is not there, then the danger is we deepen the suspicion and the cynicism about the reasons why Western countries take action. But it also means that I think it is all the more important to build consensus around the kind of action that is to be contemplated. The problem, I think, with taking the kind of action that was seen in Friday night into Saturday morning is that there are these questions over the efficacy, there are questions over the consensus behind it, and rather than building international consensus around a coordinated approach to resolving a situation and alleviating the humanitarian suffering, which should be a priority in all of that, what we do, albeit I am prepared to accept on the part of the Prime Minister inadvertently, is we risk escalating an already complicated situation.
First Minister, many thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.